So here we are, a few days into the Trump presidency, and so far it's been absolutely spectacular in terms of all the things that have already happened, rescinding DEI, um, rescinding all this environmental crap, all the various pardons. Just fantastic. And by the way, there's this site within the White House .gov site where you can go and check every day, and every day they post everything they've done in terms of these executive orders, pardons, and so on. And we've been following that sort of hour by hour. And as I said, absolutely fascinating. Such a contrast to Trump 45, where he was very poorly advised, had terrible people, and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's 8 years ago. Now it's completely different, and it's been spectacular. But one thing that hasn't happened yet, which is one thing that we'd like to see, is obviously the release of all this Russiagate stuff. Viewers will remember that on his last day in office as the 45th president, President Trump declassified the Russiagate binder with all the juicy stuff we want to see. And then Mark Meadows, his chief of staff at the time, he decided he was going to return it to the DOJ, hoping it would be released by Biden, which of course never ever happened. So for 4 years, that stuff has been hidden. And yeah, I think it's time we get to see that. And I think it will have big repercussions. It's not just an exercise in sort of academic endeavors on our part, like we want to know. I think it will have huge repercussions on just everyone understanding what really happened there with Russiagate, where it came from, and how the country of Russia was completely falsely accused of something it had nothing to do with. And that in itself can then have hopefully some good consequences in terms of Ukraine, Russia, in terms of Trump's hands being untied, in terms of trying to do something on the diplomatic front. Remember the entire 4 years that Trump was president from 2017 to 2021, he was basically, diplomacy was criminalized. He wasn't allowed to talk to Russia. So in order to be able to do that now, in order to be able to get a good result there, I think the first step should be to just put everything on the table, release everything.
Everything. And the story of how that binder, got lost, that's a whole story unto itself. But you and I have always had, I think, kind of two big points. And one of them was the fact that, Russiagate wasn't just a hoax by the Clinton campaign. It was something that fundamentally altered the entire structure of our foreign policy. Most specifically how we approached Russia, but there was ancillary effects in terms of how we approached China and how China in turn approached Russia. This wasn't just a harmless political trick that was played. It had very real world ramifications and may have led to the Ukraine war. And one of the other things that's been a hot button for us is the fact that, we have maintained that at least in some part, we think that Russiagate originated as a means to cover up what Joe Biden and really more the CIA, FBI et al., i.e. our intelligence agencies, were doing in Ukraine to begin with. So, there's a whole overlaid structure here that it's not just as simple as saying it's easy to say, oh, it's just Russiagate. Well, it's so multifaceted because not only do you want to expose the hoax, hold people domestically accountable for what they did, at least expose them and let everybody see them for what they were, but it also overlays into our foreign policy and directly into Ukraine. And Hans, I know for you, one of your hot buttons has been the fact that people do not go back to, well, it's not even the origination, but it's kind of the flashpoint maybe of 2014. So I'll turn it over to you since I know that's something.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We should really start there. Let's try and kind of untangle this whole story because Russiagate ties in with Ukraine actually directly, but that story is never told. The
Right.
fact that, to put it in very simple terms, there's a reason they chose Russia to smear Trump with. And that reason goes right back to 2014 and it goes right back to Ukraine. And before we look into the details of that, I'm going to probably say this several times here today, but I think it's so important that just to just take this in. And that is the fact that Russiagate is completely fabricated. There was nothing there. It's not one of these usual hoaxes where Trump did
Got a
something
little
silly or
element of
something
truth
wrong,
to
or
it.
he might have done whatever, and then they just kind of blew it out of all proportions and all that, which is very often the case with these hoaxes where someone, does something which isn't maybe quite right, and then, it gets exaggerated and so on. Russiagate is not one of those, despite what the media has been claiming for all these years and so on. Russiagate is a hoax that was 100% fabricated. That Trump didn't do anything wrong of any kind. No one in his campaign did anything wrong of any kind. No one colluded. No one did anything at all. Everything was entirely made up. That is just such a central point to this. And so now we get to, well, why did they make it all up concerning Russia? What was the point of choosing Russia? Of course, there's several points. There's kind of Cold War thinking. There's the fact that Trump had this Miss World pageant that he owned at the time, and it was staged in Russia in 2013, so they could physically place him there in 2013. There's the fact that his national security advisor, General Flynn, happened to have traveled to Russia, by the way, with the full knowledge and approval of the U.S. intelligence community. That part is never stated. But
The full
so they had a
blessing,
couple of
yes,
these.
and
They had a couple of
debriefing.
these data points, shall we call them, where they could sort of try and lay some breadcrumbs. So that was part of it. But the much bigger part of it, as you already suggested here, is 2014. So in 2014, Joe Biden started the Ukraine war. Now, that might sound very blunt, and people might think, oh, that isn't quite right. Well, it is right, because Ukraine at the time had a democratically elected government and a president called Yanukovych. And Ukraine has always been a very complicated country, which, by the way, has only existed since 1991. Before that, Ukraine was always part of some other, Soviet Union. Before that, other kind of groupings and so on. So it's sort of full independence, 1991, and not straightforward, because half the country is Russian speaking and the other half is Ukrainian speaking. So there's always going to be tensions, always going to be conflict. And this guy Yanukovych was actually kind of trying to keep things together until Joe Biden decided. I don't know how much he certainly pulled the trigger, but I mean, what do you think? It was probably Victoria Nuland decided.
I'm not sure that it was Newland who decided, but she was certainly the engineer. I still think it goes back to Biden and the National Security Council and maybe the top levels of the State Department. But this was a State Department directed coup against Ukraine. And it's easy to
Yeah.
point fingers at the then administration and say, oh, well, they're affiliated with Russia. Well, okay, that leaves out the fact that half of Ukraine, or a third of it, whatever the proper number is comprised of Russian citizens. There's long-standing ties there. It's also further complicated by the fact that it's run by oligarchs. It's not a clear de facto government, but nevertheless, there was a decision made to use Ukraine, as I see it, as effectively as a proxy for a war against Russia. If you want to kind of cut to the heart of it, that's it in my mind.
That is so important. The fact that smearing Yanukovych as pro-Russian is just ridiculous. It's absolutely outrageously just dumb. The guy was the Ukrainian president. He was Ukrainian. He is Ukrainian. And they deposed him. Now, they smeared him as pro-Russian because he was trying to make the best out of a very difficult situation. So Ukraine is a buffer state between the East and the West. Russia has its sort of designs, and the West also has its designs. And Ukraine is like stuck in the middle. So if you're the Ukrainian president, the best thing you can do is talk to both sides and try and, get, and that's actually what he tried to do. He tried to get a trade deal out of the West. He tried to get a trade deal out of Russia. He tried to sort of make everything work. But then with meddling from people like Newland, from people, you mentioned National Security Council, Biden back then, 11 years ago, he was probably more compos mentis. Other people, they decided that this wasn't good enough. They couldn't allow Yanukovych to do the diplomacy and the things he had to do. Again, if you're in that position and your country is sort of has Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, is split between East. There's a big river in Ukraine called the Dnieper, which kind of runs right through the middle of it, and that's kind of the dividing line.
Mm-hmm.
It's a physical one, but historically, often rivers are physical dividing lines between this and that, and so he was trying to keep it together. As you mentioned, he also had a bunch of oligarchs whom he had to kind of keep happy because they hold a lot of sway in that country. It was a very difficult situation. And what does Joe Biden do? To get to the point here, he goes in and says, "Oh, let's have a coup here. Let's get rid of this guy and let's install our own guy." And then everything turned to they only installed Western people. So they had that Yatsenyuk that Nuland talked about on the phone, like, "Oh, we're going to install him," and you know what? 2 weeks later, he was the prime minister of that country. And so
We just stop there for just a moment. Is that phone call, that taped phone call between Victoria Nuland, was probably caught by Russian forces, that was between Jeffrey Pyatt and Victoria Nuland, is such an astonishing phone call, because they lay out that in very casual terms, like they're talking almost, like friends over coffee, about how they're going to restructure the entirety of Ukraine and who's going to be in, who's going to be out, who's going to be operating from the inside, the outside. And by the way, saying, hey, I think we need Biden. I heard that he's willing. And every single thing that was released in that conversation happened exactly as they wanted it to. And not years later, but just almost immediately.
yeah, it was within the space of about 12 days, 14 days,
Yeah.
something that everything they talked about actually happened. They even belittled people like Klitschko, the boxer, like, well,
Yeah.
we don't want him. We want this other guy. And yeah, Biden's willing. That's what they said. Sullivan was involved as well. Of course, everything he touches also turned to crap. But so that was sort of the original sin. And what happened after that is you immediately seeded conflict. It was automatic. You had a guy there, Yanukovych, who was trying to keep the peace. Whatever you might think about him, corruption, this, that, and the other, in that kind of country, that's what you have to do. You have to try and make all sides happy to an extent where there's at least going to be no war. And there was no war, and this is the important part, because as soon as Biden installed his puppets, Putin went into Crimea. This is also often forgotten. It's like, oh, Putin seized Crimea in 2014. Well, what happened exactly right before he did that? The Biden-led coup happened before he did that. So that part's always forgotten as well. Now, why did Putin do that? Well, because he's got his ports. I mean, he's got his navy there. I mean, he couldn't just let it be now that the country was handed over in a coup to these Western Ukrainians, or more Western aligned, or whatever you want to call it. And what also happened right then and there was that you kicked off the civil war in the east of Ukraine, where the Russian-speaking people didn't like the situation they were in, especially Donbass. So you had the war over there. And that, by the way, everyone knows about the MH17. That was the Malaysian Airlines that was shot down. Also in 2014 in July. Everyone knows about that, but no one knows that is because of that civil war that started in 2014. So that's the origin of all this. So when we say the Ukraine war started in 2022, well, on a big scale, yeah, but on the regional scale, it started much earlier in 2014, and Biden is at the core of that. So the idea of then using Russia because immediately when that happened, of course, Russia was the pariah. Oh, Russia seized Crimea. Russia is bad. Russia is supporting these Donbass separatists. They're just Russian speakers who are not happy with their country, with their government having been deposed by Biden effectively. So all of that was blamed on Russia, which of course led itself perfectly to then making Russia the pariah, and then hence Trump is colluding with Russia. So that's the sort of the narrative part. But then there's also the part that you've written about, which is not the narrative part, but the cover-up part of it.
Yeah, first of all, it also didn't start in 2014, and in my opinion, that when Yanukovych was elected, that was basically in the face of CIA efforts to do otherwise. So there's a story behind that story, as there always is. But sure enough, you have this overthrow, and that's the exact same time that Joe Biden not only came in to assist with this, but that he sort of set up shop in Ukraine. And, he came in April, and Hunter came in at exactly the same time. And he and Hunter and Devon Archer were meeting with Mykola Zlochevsky over in Italy, another country, but they were meeting with him probably for optics at the exact same time that Biden was in his first visit in Ukraine. And so you've got kind of this parallel pattern that Joe Biden has always had, and that is wherever he moves in to do, his foreign relation work, etc., Hunter always follows almost immediately and sets up shop to milk the Biden name, and that's exactly what happened. And it's also worth mentioning that Ukraine is incredibly resource rich. an incredibly valuable country. So not only is it a proxy battle and it serves as a proxy for a war with Russia, but there's also, I think, a very real control issue of over all those natural resources that Ukraine has at their disposal. And Ukraine's a pretty divided country run by oligarchs. But as Joe Biden set up shop, it always seems like this story gets told in isolation, that it's just Joe Biden and Hunter on the board of Burisma. And okay, bad, corruption, etc., fine. But it ignores the fact as if Obama was somehow carved out from all this. As if Obama had no idea that his vice president was conducting, major levels of diplomacy in Ukraine and had his son there operating in Burisma. Heck, we ended up with a former high-level CIA operative on the same board with him, Cofer Black. So this idea that Obama had no knowledge of what Biden was doing in Ukraine is just laughable on the face of it. And one of the things that we wrote about was this, we kind of walked through the sequence of events, especially as they culminated into the first half of 2016. And it becomes apparent that the U.S. is completely structuring not only the government of Ukraine, but the prosecutor's office in Ukraine to basically cover for whatever Hunter was doing at the same time. And so without getting into all the details, basically our theory was that Russiagate evolved as a means to cover up what Joe Biden was doing in Ukraine. Not so much for Joe Biden, but for Obama and for the State Department and for the CIA. And that's ultimately how Russiagate came into being and why it focused on Russia, the enemy of Ukraine. And then all the other things, Michael Flynn and everything else, those things happen to be, I think, matters of convenience. They were looking for any touches that would fit the narrative. And what did? They found Carter Page and they found General Flynn's dinner, and all that nonsense. And they focused immediately and tightly on that. But
we have these two data points which are crucially important here. In December of 2015, all this Biden corruption in Ukraine, which, by the way, we haven't mentioned this yet. He's pardoned his entire family, going back to exactly that time frame. In 2015, in December, the legacy media actually back then, 10 years ago, I guess things were still a little bit different because they actually wanted to do an expose on it. And they did to an extent. So the New York Times actually wrote about Biden corruption in Ukraine. There's an actual article. I mean, it sounds pretty...
It was a big one, and it was a big deal at the time.
It sounds pretty crazy from today's perspective, but that happened. And Obama's energy czar, a guy called Amos Hochstein, was knee-deep entangled in that story in both trying to cover it up, but also trying to kind of make it not happen, or at least sort of, he was communicating with Biden. He was warning Biden that this was going to happen. He was kind of, let's just say he was scrambling. And this was Obama's guy. And as you say, there's no way on earth that, obviously Obama would have seen the New York Times expose, but there's also no way on earth that before it came out, people like Hochstein and whatever would not have told Obama, look, we have a problem because the vice president's son has been embezzling money in Ukraine. And, just if I can digress here for a moment, the guy that initially hired Hunter to protect him was actually in the Yanukovych government, the oligarch Zlochevsky. So that's another twist on this tale where Hunter or the Bidens were protecting someone who had been deposed by, Biden's coup, which is, sounds very strange, but that just goes to show that Biden's politics and Biden's corruption doesn't necessarily align. He'll do the corruption on any side for any reason, and the politics. Well, as you said, that wasn't just Biden's decision. We're going to have a coup there. There were so many voices in the U.S. involved, and as you said, they were already, the intelligence community was already extremely unhappy back in 2010 when Yanukovych was elected in the first place, and before that, I mean, they've been meddling for a long, long time. But so coming back to 2015, December 2015, you had this big expose, and you needed something to talk about that was different. That was the bad guy. Well, the bad guy is Russia. And it's no surprise that The earliest records we have of this Russiagate plot being formed within the Clinton campaign was within a few weeks of that, early 2016. That's what we have in terms of documentary evidence. It might have started even earlier, but those two things overlap pretty neatly.
Yeah, and just to add another element to that timeline, so you had the New York Times article that was coming out in late 2015, right at the same time that Joe Biden was preparing to go to Ukraine, which was an uncomfortable place for them to be. So you have these incredible email chains leading up to the New York Times story where they're clearly prepping for it. And everybody's on this email chain. We're talking about people like Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Pyatt, both on this email chain, fully aware that they're crafting a response. And one of the things that the Biden administration prepped for was questions from reporters about Mykola Zlochevsky, who happens to be the owner of Burisma. And there's an important distinction here to be made. Mykola Zlochevsky was part of the earlier administration that the Biden administration overthrew. So you would think on the face of it, they would be viscerally opposed to aligning themselves with him because he's part of the administration that they orchestrated a coup for. But rather than doing that, they aligned themselves with him and they prep for questions about, how do you find yourself supporting, a criminal in Zlochevsky? And I think the answer they came up with was something very generic, like, well, we're not really, we don't have any opinion on those matters or something ridiculous. But they were thinking about these things in advance. And there's still even another element is that Congress was involved in this. Congress was actually lobbying on behalf of Burisma and Mykola Zlochevsky, again, part of the old administration that's supposed to be bad, at the behest of Hunter Biden in 2014 and into 2015. So there's all these incredible twists. And again, throughout all of this, it's impossible that Obama was not aware of everything. His top level officials were part of the prepping.
Didn't you tweet at Murphy the other day about this?
Oh, yeah. I love going after Chris Murphy on this. He was one of the primary senators that was on this. It's anybody can get it, and I've linked it in the tweet. It's a document where it's Blue Star Strategies is basically, oh no, it's actually, pardon me, that was the PR firm. It's Boy Schiller. It's the law firm that Hunter worked at. And they were approaching the senators in Congress and basically lobbying them to get them to lobby on behalf specifically of Burisma and Mykola Zlochevsky as like good guys, people we should support. And they were successful in their efforts with a number of different senators and representatives. But Senator Murphy was on there. His chief of staff was involved in doing it. Murphy himself. We can throw up the tweet in there, the link, or if nothing else, the link to the document, and you can see for yourself. But so the point of all this is all these different points of entry into the story from the U.S. government on both a formal and on an informal basis, coupled with the fact that you've got the CIA operating on behalf of the State Department and with the State Department in the background. You also have the FBI there. The FBI established an office at the newly formulated prosecutor's office known as NABU, kind of the anti-corruption division. Well, guess who created that whole division? Joe Biden. And then they placed the FBI there to be working in the background to the point where they literally had an office on site. To this day, we can't see the operating agreement that was drafted between Ukraine and the FBI. They went to court to prevent it. So, the FBI, in our opinion, was kind of there as a backstop. Keep an eye on things and keep stories like the one that came out in the beginning of 2016 about Hunter Biden being caught up in money laundering operations. Latvia made those allegations. FBI made them go away. So, again, you can kind of see from, I know we're, touching on a lot of different things, but from all these different points of contact and involvement, the government was enmeshed in all of this and they didn't want it getting out.
This is exactly right. Maybe if we just zoom out and we can just sum up here, you have intelligence community involvement for years, perhaps decades, State Department, you mentioned FBI, CIA, and so on. You've got Biden personally kicking off that war there. That he didn't want people talking about that. You had Newland, all these people. You had the corruption with Biden Jr. And by the way, firing the prosecutor happened at exactly the same time that
Correct.
this Russiagate hoax got kicked off as well, early 2016. So all of these things happening at the same time. You had Hochstein, you had Obama's involvement, all of that. Now, what do all these people not want? Well, they don't want us talking about that. They don't want us talking about Ukraine. They don't want us talking about all the bad things the United States did there, or these people did there, nor about Biden corruption, nor about any of those things. So what do? Well, they pin it all on Russia. Russia is bad. Russia is terrible. And Trump is aligned with Russia. And Russia is the pariah and so on. Purely for the purpose of not talking about Ukraine. Ukraine good, Russia bad. And ultimately, for a long time, they succeeded in that because all we ever talked about was Russia.
Well, also, even think about where the Russiagate scandal kind of started. It effectively started more or less with Manafort in terms of coming in. There was early preparation by, was it Alexander Chalupa, was already scouting Manafort and somehow miraculously knew that he was going to become the run Trump's campaign before Manafort or Trump knew it themselves, or at least before Trump knew it. And it was the same thing, that you had this operation where you had the Ukrainian ambassador coming out publicly writing an op-ed against Trump. You had the origination of the Black Ledger, which, as far as we can tell, is complete fiction. The Black Ledger originated out of Ukraine. By the way, went through Nabu's offices where the FBI was located. They were the ones that disclosed it. The Black Ledger took out Manafort. That was the beginning of tainting Trump in the summer of 2016 with all those allegations of Russia collusion.
And again, they flipped it around. Manafort's offenses, if any, all had to do with Ukraine, had nothing to do with
Correct.
Russia whatsoever. But
Good point.
It was just narrative creation. Manafort aligned with Russia. Well, where? What? There was nothing there. He had advised Ukrainian leaders, and apparently he had sort of some financial irregularities as part of that. Okay, it's like show me the man, I'll find you the crime kind of thing. But where was Russia? It just wasn't there. So it was all to do with narrative, but again, looking back, hugely successful, because all that anyone ever talked about, especially the media, which by the way back then had more sway, is Russia. Russia is terrible and Putin's terrible and Trump couldn't possibly talk. Trump wasn't even allowed to talk to the Russian ambassador, which is part of his job as president, in his first term. As soon as the Russian ambassador shows up in his office, the media had a meltdown. As soon as Jeff Sessions happened to be in the same room as the Russian ambassador, they made him recuse, and on and on. So it was wildly successful. So we've kind of skipped forward here now. So the Russia collusion hoax did not work at first because Trump was elected, but then they just ramped it up and used it throughout Trump's presidency. Now we're kind of getting back here to what might be done about it now with declassification and so on, because everything in terms of Trump's presidency to do with diplomacy was basically hamstrung. He was not allowed to do anything. As we just said, anytime he met anyone with a Russian name, the media had a meltdown. He met Putin in Helsinki, and Putin gave him a football, as in a soccer football, for Barron, his son, who is a soccer fan. The media had a massive meltdown, saying that the football was was wired in some way. There was spying devices. It was just completely unreal, the hysteria. Yet all of that happened. So Trump was never allowed to do anything in terms of Russia, in terms of diplomacy. Remember, the war was already going on at the time in the Donbass. The Crimea question was already a huge issue. All of these things existed, but Trump was never given a shot at fixing anything, because if he just had anything to do with Russia at all, a conversation or anything, just any contact point of any kind, it was immediate hysteria, meltdown. So he never had the chance. And it was the Russia collusion hoax that prevented that from happening.
Moreover, it was the Russia collusion hoax via Ukraine. That's what led to Trump's impeachment. What was Trump impeached over? The phone call with the new Ukrainian president, which is now Zelensky, and basically starting to poke around and ask questions about what went on in Ukraine in 2014, 15, and 16. And of course, that provoked this visceral, systemic response, which can only be, in my mind, ascribed to fear, i.e., exposure, that led to the immediate impeachment of President Trump once again over Ukraine.
And one of the things that is not said nearly often enough, I read about that in my book here, by the way, Swiftboating America, is when did the Ukraine hoax, the impeachment hoax, start? It started the day after Robert Mueller's train wreck testimony in Congress. So everyone remembers after this Mueller report, Democrats asked Mueller to come in, and then they thought, okay, this is how we're going to finally get Trump, because Mueller is going to tell us that, he colluded, or he's going to tell us something we can use. And I'm sure that was the idea and that was the plan, but Mueller was completely out of it. The guy was just,
He was
I
what
would say
Biden would become.
exactly. He just not there, mentally not there. He was just senile old man. Wasn't making any sense. It was just a complete and total train wreck for Democrats. They knew that day, okay, this was in July of 2019. This isn't gonna get us anywhere. This is a dead end. We're done here with this. Okay, new hoax. The very next day, the Ukraine impeachment hoax started. I mean, that's just how obvious that connection is. You're absolutely right. But ultimately, we end up in a situation where Trump was just never given the opportunity to help fix that mess. And what happened is instead Biden became president, and then the mess got a lot worse. That what Trump wasn't allowed to fix, where there was kind of embers, then started to become this giant fire, which is the Ukraine war, as it's been raging for the past few years under Biden.
Well, what were the
And now,
first efforts by the Biden administration? They were to go out and poke the bear, literally, by pushing for Ukraine's membership in NATO, something that wasn't going to happen, but was, that was the bright line for Putin, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They pushed that button repeatedly, trying to provoke what they ultimately got.
exactly. And so, what can we do about it now? Now, Trump's tweeted about it, or he sent a truth about it, where he is just calling on Putin to put an end to it, kind of appealing very strongly, threatened some economic sanctions. Not sure how, after Biden took away, Russia's membership of the SWIFT system and so on. I think most of whatever can be done on that front has been done. But that, of course, then brought us. Offline, we had a bit of a discussion, which also included our friend Ryan here, who he actually tweeted about this. He had a very good idea. Why not basically apologize to Russia for the Russia collusion hoax and use that as a springboard to do something on this entire Ukraine issue?
Yeah, and I don't know how easy or not easy it will be to apologize to Russia, but one way to do that on a practical basis is to release the Russiagate documents. Let
Exactly.
everybody see, the whole world, not everybody, let everybody see what was done. And they can start drawing their own conclusions, I think, pretty quickly. But get that open and have it just in full sunlight.
Exactly right. Because what it will show, and this takes us back to where we started off here today, is that Russia had nothing to do with any of it. There was nothing. There was no Russia collusion. There was no Russian interference beyond, what was written in that god awful report by CIA director back then, John Brennan, where he said, "Oh, a Russian RT channel did a bad show on Hillary." Just completely ridiculous stuff. I think once people realize that there was nothing to it, the whole thing was completely made up, and it wasn't made up in Russia or involving any Russians other than Christopher Steele's supposed source, who was actually a Brookings Institute intern in DC. Well, he was originally from Russia, so maybe that's as close as you can get to Russia with this whole hoax. But this was made up in the US and in Britain by Steele. It was made up by the Clinton campaign. It was made up by, all these other people we talked about in some form. They were all pulling in the same direction on this. Russia is bad. Ukraine is good, for all the reasons we explained. So I think once you have more people realizing that there was just nothing to it. No, it's not one of those where there's smoke, there's fire. No, there was just nothing to it. Russia was smeared. Trump was obviously the biggest victim in all of this, but uh, diplomacy was, a pretty close second in terms of being a victim here, because Russia was smeared that they did all this horrible stuff, which they didn't do. I'm sure they did a lot of other horrible stuff in a lot of other horrible in a lot of other places, and you can talk about all these kinds of things. But right now, we're talking about Russia collusion hoax. They didn't do anything. It was all done. It was all fabricated. And I think if that's all on the table, as you say, declassify everything, get the binder out, get everything out, and make it clear once and for all that there was just nothing to it, zero, nothing. For starters, that gives Trump a fresh, hand in terms of dealing with it, which he wasn't allowed to do for the first 4 years, for the reasons we explained. And as you suggested, it also kind of it gives Russia a reason to I'm not talking about not necessarily trust or anything like that, but at least to sort of go along for, okay,
Yeah.
thanks for admitting that. Thanks for, admitting we had nothing to do with that. And yeah, maybe we should just all sit down here and see how we get out of this mess. So it would be a good start. So it's not just an academic exercise. It's not just like, oh, let's declassify because, you and I and some other people on the internet are interested in this stuff. It goes way beyond that.
It goes to holding people accountable, putting responsibility where it belongs. And a side note of what it's going to do, it's also, I think, going to shine a very bright light on Obama.